Well, we're going to take you inside the courtroom today for the next hour. But American political history demands that we begin with what happened outside the courthouse today when the Republican Party boldly and bravely rose up in spirited defense of adultery with porn stars, secretly paying off porn stars to buy their silence, and creating false business records to hide payoffs to porn stars by Republican candidates. The Republican Party did not specify whether its bans on abortion should include exceptions for pregnancies resulting from Republican political candidates having sex with porn stars. At 9:51 a.m., Michael Cohen was shown an invoice that he created to facilitate Donald Trump's false bookkeeping, record keeping, to cover up Donald Trump's reimbursement to Michael Cohen for paying off porn star Stormy Daniels to buy her silence about what she says was a very brief sexual encounter with Donald Trump. Question: was this invoice a false record? Answer: yes, ma'am. Donald Trump is facing the criminal charge of falsifying business records. And exactly 15 minutes after Michael Cohen said that, the highest-ranking Republican in America stood outside the courthouse where Michael Cohen was testifying about false business records and said this.
President Trump is a friend, and I wanted to be here to support him.
That means Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who is a Southern Baptist and publicly uses his religion to defend and explain everything he does and says, has now proclaimed himself to support a friend who, as Johnson's religion would describe it, committed adultery with Stormy Daniels and then arranged to pay off Stormy Daniels and then arranged to create false business records to cover up his payoff to Stormy Daniels. Mike Johnson, who uses his religion as both a sword and a shield every day, brought not just himself, but the full weight of the Republican Party to a microphone today to declare his support for, and the party's support, for everything Donald Trump is accused of in this trial, because here is what Speaker Johnson did not say today. I don't believe Stormy Daniels. In fact, Speaker Johnson didn't say a word about Stormy Daniels. Speaker Johnson did not attempt to deny a single word of the evidence that has been presented against Donald Trump. And that leaves Speaker Johnson supporting Donald Trump no matter what Donald Trump did sexually with Stormy Daniels or what Donald Trump did criminally with Michael Cohen.
President Trump is a friend, and I wanted to be here to support him.
That is the profoundly perverted depth to which Donald Trump has personally pushed the most overtly religious Speaker of the House in history. No other speaker has ever worn and wielded his religion as his professed guide in every single thing that he does, in every single vote, and in everything he says. Religiosity is to Mike Johnson what vulgarity is to Donald Trump. It is the essence of the man. And so, in supporting his friend Donald Trump today, Mike Johnson unwittingly destroyed the facade of his own political religiosity. As Mike Johnson was debasing himself at the courthouse today, Michael Cohen was asked, quote, was this check stub a false statement? Answer: yes, ma'am. Michael Cohen repeatedly said, yes, ma'am, to prosecutor Susan Hoffinger, who asked him about all of the checks he received from Donald Trump as reimbursement for Michael Cohen's payment of $130,000 to Stormy Daniels. Each of those reimbursements to Michael Cohen, each of them was mislabeled as being for legal services rendered instead of as a simple reimbursement, which is what they really were. Michael Cohen's testimony fully delivered all of the elements of the false business records charge in the district attorney's indictment of Donald Trump. And Michael Cohen's testimony also delivered the necessary evidence to prove that Donald Trump's decision to order the payoff to Stormy Daniels was to save his presidential campaign, not to save his marriage. At the direction of was the key phrase that we all read 6 years ago in the federal indictment of Michael Cohen for an illegal Trump campaign contribution in that payment to Stormy Daniels for the benefit of candidate Trump and the Trump campaign. The indictment and Michael Cohen's guilty plea said that he made that payment, quote, at the direction of individual one. Individual one turned out, of course, to be Donald Trump. Michael Cohen used that phrase today on the witness stand under oath to describe that he made the payment, quote, at the direction of Donald J. Trump and for the benefit of Donald J. Trump. The surprise of the day was cross-examination. There were two surprises. One, Donald Trump's lead defense lawyer, Todd Blanche, had nothing. One of our guests tonight, Tim O'Brien, predicted to me that Todd Blanche's cross-examination would be terrible. He was right. Todd Blanche did not score a single relevant point against Michael Cohen. The other big surprise was that Michael Cohen maintained his poise and reasonable tone that he established in direct examination by the prosecutor that few of us expected Michael Cohen to be able to maintain under the stress and challenges of cross-examination. But Todd Blanche presented no challenges. He tried to wake up the jury with his first question. Todd Blanche, Mr. Cohen, my name is Todd Blanche. You and I have never spoken or met before, have we? Michael Cohen, we have not. Question, but you know who I am, don't you? Answer, I do. Question, as a matter of fact, on April 23rd, so after the trial started in this case, you went on TikTok and called me a crying little shit, didn't you? Answer, sounds like something I would say. But the jury already knew that Michael Cohen doesn't like Donald Trump anymore. So it came as no surprise to them that Michael Cohen, who has already testified to being profane, might say something about Donald Trump's lawyer like that. The only person who needed waking up in that room today was Donald Trump, whose eyes remained closed by my observation for about 90% of the day. This is wildly beyond what we've seen before. It is impossible for Donald Trump not to be asleep during some of his long, extended, eye-closing sessions, including Michael Cohen's cross-examination. Donald Trump has insisted, after first being caught sleeping, that he is not sleeping. He is just resting his eyes. But no eyes need to be rested the entire day, even 77-year-old Trump eyes. And Donald Trump, who is so aware of everything his face is doing when, for example, taking a mugshot or being on public display in any way, leaves his face with his eyes closed, in tortured, elderly shapes when he drifts off into his closed eye space. His mouth shifts from its preferred scowl to the look of a collapsing old building. The mouth loses all shape. The lips become unrecognizable by the wrinkled curves that they take under those closed eyes that stay closed today longer than they have ever stayed closed in that courtroom. More than 10 minutes at a time. The old man sitting there in the defendant's chair, head tilted back to the right, eyes closed, made it look like a trial at a nursing home. If he were found like that in his chair at a table in the nursing home during lunch, he would be immediately checked for signs of life. His lawyers have just given up on trying to keep Donald Trump awake. The trick that seemed to work so well yesterday, giving him printed comments full of praise about him to read, didn't work today. Nothing worked, especially the Trump defense. Todd Blanche has tried and will continue to try to use Michael Cohen's own public words to emphasize how much Michael Cohen hates Donald Trump. But the problem with that, with an American jury, is that Michael Cohen is speaking for at least 100 million people in America. At least a third of the country, and some days maybe half of the country, hates Donald Trump as much as Michael Cohen does. No juror is going to be shocked that Michael Cohen hates Donald Trump. They all know people who hate Donald Trump, as do most Americans. What the prosecution was able to do was tell the story effectively through Michael Cohen's testimony about how Donald Trump and Michael Cohen committed crimes together and how that destroyed Michael Cohen's life, leaving Michael Cohen with more reason than most Americans to hate Donald Trump. I will always protect Mr. Trump, said Michael Cohen in a written statement to the media in the second year of Donald Trump's presidency, that was introduced in evidence today. And that's when Michael Cohen was, quote, knee deep into the cult of Donald Trump. Cult member Michael Cohen was stunned when the FBI knocked on his door to serve a search warrant in an investigation begun by our first guest tonight, former federal prosecutor Andrew Weissmann. Michael Cohen spoke to Donald Trump on the phone after the FBI raid on April 9th, 2019. And according to Michael Cohen's testimony today, Donald Trump told him, quote, don't worry, everything is going to be fine. I am president of the United States. That turned out to be the last time Michael Cohen spoke to his cult leader. Michael Cohen testified today, I felt reassured. I had the president of the United States protecting me. And then came the messages from Donald Trump, some of them direct communication, indirect communications through others, which Michael Cohen testified he took to mean, don't flip. Donald Trump was paying Michael Cohen's legal fees then in a joint defense agreement with Michael Cohen when Michael Cohen was getting the don't flip message. It was 11:30 a.m. in the courtroom when Michael Cohen said, don't flip. And at that moment, the trial took on the familiar tone of a mafia trial. Michael Cohen was concerned that Robert Costello, a lawyer who wanted to defend him in the FBI investigation, would not represent Michael Cohen's best interests. Michael Cohen testified that Attorney Costello, who used to work with Rudolph Giuliani, wanted to establish a back channel, what he called a back channel, from Michael Cohen through Robert Costello to Rudy Giuliani to Donald Trump in the White House. Michael Cohen wanted to be able to talk to his own defense lawyer without necessarily telling Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump everything that he told his lawyer. And an email to Michael Cohen trying to convince him to maintain that back channel of communication, Attorney Robert Costello wrote, you are loved, with the Trumpian oddity of the word love in the email being in quotation marks. One of those odd use of quotation marks you see in Donald Trump tweets and posts. Question, what did you understand Mr. Costello to mean by you are loved? By whom? Answer, by President Trump. And that's what Michael Cohen always wanted. Donald Trump's respect, Donald Trump's admiration, Donald Trump's love. But by then, Michael Cohen probably knew that Donald Trump is incapable of love. And luckily for Michael Cohen, his family was capable of love, even after the horror that they experienced of an FBI raid that Michael Cohen brought into their family home. Michael Cohen's wife and his daughter, then in college, and his son, then in high school, did something of an intervention on Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen testified that it was conversation with his family that made him decide that it was time to escape the Trump cult. Question, by that time, in late August of 2018, what, if anything, had you decided about whether you would continue to lie for President Trump? Answer, I made a decision based on the conversation that I had with my family. I would not lie for President Trump any longer. Question, if not for the campaign, Mr. Cohen, would you have paid that money to Stormy Daniels? Answer, no, ma'am. Michael Cohen said that the day he pleaded guilty was, quote, the worst day of my life. Donald Trump issued a tweet that day aimed at Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen told the jury that today that when he testified to Congress about paying off Stormy Daniels and being reimbursed by Donald Trump and showing Congress the actual checks used to reimburse him, quote, I apologize to Congress, I apologize to the country, I apologize to my family. The final question the prosecutor asked Michael Cohen before handing him over for cross-examination was, question, Mr. Cohen, do you have any regrets about your past work and your association with Donald Trump? Answer, I do. Question, what are they? Answer, I regret doing things for him that I should not have, lying, bullying people in order to effectuate a goal. I don't regret working at the Trump Organization because, as I expressed before, some very interesting, great times. But to keep the loyalty and to do the things that he had asked me to do, I violated my moral compass, and I suffered the penalty, as has my family. And so, in careful, thorough description through question and answer, Michael Cohen's story contained the classic arc of tragedy. Michael Cohen, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, made the long and unlikely climb all the way up to a meeting with the President of the United States in the Oval Office. He stood there that day in the White House, floating high up in the thinner air with the title Personal Attorney to the President of the United States. He reached an altitude he never thought he could reach. But there he was, in the Oval Office, reaching that high altitude, a higher altitude than his father could have dreamed for his son, or Michael Cohen could have dreamed for himself. Question, while you were visiting the White House, did you have a private conversation with then President Trump? Answer, I did. Question, first, where did the conversation take place? Answer, in the Oval Office. Question, did you discuss in the Oval Office the reimbursement payments that were going to be made to you? Answer, yes, ma'am. Question, can you tell the jury a bit about that conversation? Answer, so I was sitting with President Trump and he asked me if I was okay. He asked me if I needed money and I said, no, all good. He said, because I can get a check. And I said, no. I said, I'm okay. He said, all right, just make sure you deal with Alan. Question, did he say anything about anything would be forthcoming? Answer, excuse me, did he say anything about what would be forthcoming to you? Answer, yes. It would be a check for January and February. Question. And so at that point in time, you had not yet been reimbursed for the payments that you made to Stormy Daniels. Answer, no, ma'am. And so when Michael Cohen is played by a great actor, you will feel sorry for him. If you were in the courtroom today, you could, for the first time, begin to understand him.